if you're joining us today, you're probably already deeply familiar with the structural anomalies of the Book of Genesis.
Right, the stuff that really makes you scratch your head.
Exactly. I mean, you know the standard academic interpretations, right? You know about the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP sources, and the obvious Mesopotamian parallels, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish.
Yeah, we don't need to rehash the basics of ancient Near Eastern comparative literature for you today.
No, definitely not. Instead, we're looking at something completely out of left field. Something that, frankly, made me stop dead in my tracks and, completely rethink the entire mechanical architecture of the text.
It really is a massive paradigm shift.
Because if you've ever sat down and parsed through the antediluvian genealogies, those pre-flood chapters where you have figures like Methuselah or Jared living for like 800 or 900 years, the sheer friction those numbers cause.
Oh, absolutely. They completely defy biology.
Right. They just don't fit our biological reality. And the text, it never pauses to offer a physiological explanation for why these people are essentially immortal, only for human lifespans to violently and suddenly compress to our standard mortality shortly after.
It creates a massive interpretive headache, honestly. And historically, we've seen scholars try to solve this with, well, a variety of bandages.
Like what, exactly?
Well, some suggest mathematical translation errors, saying perhaps they were counting lunar cycles or months as years instead of actual solar years.
Right, trying to make the math work.
Exactly.
Oh.
And others just write it off as standard ancient myth-making. Like it's a rhetorical device designed to elevate the founders of a culture to a quasi-divine status.
Which is the easy way out, I think.
It is. We instinctively try to force a conventional linear historical framework onto a text that is actively resisting it. We treat these anomalies like typos in the historical record that just need to be corrected or hand-waved away.
Right. But what if they aren't typos? What if they're actually precisely calculated data points in a completely different conceptual framework?
And we've just been using the wrong cipher to decode them this whole time.
Exactly. That is the exact premise of our deep dive today. We're exploring this fascinating and honestly radical paper from June 2026 titled Significance of Plato to Genesis.
It's written by a researcher credited simply as a .author.
Right, and the mission for this deep dive is to unpack this totally mind-bending framework the author proposes. They argue that the bizarre, illogical elements of Genesis aren't random mysteries at all.
Not at all.
Instead, they perfectly align with and can be fully decoded by a very specific cosmological myth from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato.
Which, as you noted when we first discussed this, is an incredibly bold premise. Outrageous even at first glance.
Oh, totally outrageous.
But the author went looking for the underlying logic to explain the weirdness of the Genesis lifespans, right? This sudden catastrophic shift from quasi-eternal life to short biological mortality.
And they claim to have found the ultimate blueprint for this in a Socratic dialogue written by Plato.
Yes, specifically a dialogue called the Statesman. Now, I want to establish our parameters for you right here at the start. We are not exploring this as a theological assertion of faith.
Right, we're not preaching here.
Exactly. Nor are we trying to prove a literal historical sequence of events. We're looking at this as a complex literary and philosophical puzzle.
The author is suggesting that Greek philosophy holds the structural key to unlocking the underlying logic of ancient scripture, which is just wild.
It is, but it's also incredibly compelling once you see the mechanics of it.
Okay, let's unpack this right away, because the elephant in the room is the timeline. I mean, if you're listening to this and mentally checking the dates, you're probably already screaming in your device.
Yeah, the anachronism is glaring.
Right, because Plato was writing in the 4th century BCE. The source texts of Genesis, even by the most conservative historical critical estimates, are hundreds of years older than that.
Oh, at least hundreds of years.
So I have to push back here immediately. How on earth does a author reconcile this timeline issue? Are they suggesting Plato time traveled? Or that the Genesis redactors in the Hellenistic period completely rewrote their foundational texts to match a Greek philosopher?
That is exactly the friction point you have to address first. The author isn't necessarily arguing a direct linear plagiarism where, a Hebrew scribe sat down with a scroll of Plato.
Okay, so what is the argument then?
Rather, they're arguing that both texts, Genesis and Plato's Statesman, are drawing upon or structurally utilizing the exact same cosmological macro myth.
Oh, I see, like a shared cultural blueprint.
Exactly. Or, more intriguingly, that the final redaction of Genesis, which did happen during a period of heavy Hellenistic influence, deliberately adopted this specific Platonic concept of time as a literary framing device.
Wow.
Yeah, the argument is that if you overlay Plato's model of the universe onto Genesis, every single anomaly in the biblical text suddenly, mathematically resolves itself.
So it's less about who copied whom and more about realizing that they're both running on the exact same underlying operating system.
That's a great way to put it, an operating system.
And to understand that operating system, we have to completely discard our modern concept of time. Because, I mean, we think of time as thermodynamic entropy, right?
Yeah, an arrow that shoots forward.
Yeah, expanding infinitely in one direction from the Big Bang. But the core mechanism the author pulls from Plato's Statesman proposes a universe that operates like a giant manual clock.
Yes, the mechanics of time in this framework are deeply counterintuitive, but they are the absolute bedrock of the author's entire argument.
Walk us through it. How does Plato's clock work?
Well, in the Statesman, Plato describes a universe that does not possess infinite forward momentum. It is a bounded system.
Okay, meaning it has limits.
Exactly. The divine helmsman, the creator, essentially takes the helm of the universe and winds it up, rotating it in one specific direction.
Like winding a watch.
Yes, but eventually the helmsman lets go. And because the universe is a physical, bounded mechanism, it can only hold that tension for so long.
So it can't just keep spinning forever.
Right. When it reaches its absolute limit, the mechanism reverses, the gears catch, and the entire cosmic rotation, including the flow of time itself, flows backward.
That is, I mean, that's just a crazy concept to visualize.
It really is. And this oscillation creates two distinct, fundamentally opposing ages of development in the cosmos.
I was actually trying to visualize this when I read the paper, and the best analogy I could come up with is one of those old metal wind-up toy cars.
Oh, yeah, the ones you pull back on the carpet.
Exactly. You press it down against the floor and you pull it backward, right? You're forcing it against its natural resting state, winding the internal spring tighter and tighter, building up immense kinetic tension.
Building potential energy, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That is the first stage. Then you let it go, the spring releases, and it travels forward across the kitchen floor. That's the second age.
That's a perfect analogy.
But imagine if the universe is that wind-up toy. What does it actually look like when the gears are moving in that initial forced direction? Because if time is moving backward relative to our current experience, causality itself would be completely inverted.
That inversion of causality is the crucial mechanism here. And it's precisely where the author's theory begins to map onto the early chapters of Genesis.
How so?
Well, when the cosmic clock is being wound up, when the gears are moving in that initial direction, the physical rules of reality are the complete opposite of what we experience today. Plato calls this first swing of the pendulum the age of Cronus.
The age of Cronus.
In contrast, our current era, the unwinding of the spring, is the age of Zeus.
So we're in the unwinding phase now.
Exactly. And to understand the strangeness of the antediluvian patriarchs in Genesis, the author argues we have to fully immerse ourselves in the physics of the age of Cronus.
And here is where the text gets brilliantly surreal, because the author's extraction of the age of Cronus reads like high-concept science fiction.
It really does. It's totally alien to us.
In this age, human existence doesn't function through biology at all.
Nope.
People do not give birth. Sexual reproduction, genetics, embryonic development, none of that exists. The text states that the earth yields humans as though they grow like plants within the dirt.
Yes.
It is a literal plant-human paradise. You don't have parents, you have topsoil.
It's a radical departure from biological reality. But notice how the author ties this specific Platonic concept directly to the linguistics of Genesis.
This part blew my mind.
Right. We are all deeply familiar with the biblical refrain, man comes from dust and returns to dust.
Yeah, you hear it at every funeral.
Exactly. And for millennia, theologians and philosophers have interpreted that phrase as a poignant metaphor, a poetic reflection on mortality, decomposition, and the fundamental humility of the human condition.
The cycle of life, basically.
Right. But the author makes a startling claim. If we view Genesis through the structural lens of the age of Cronus, dust to dust isn't a metaphor at all.
It's literal.
It is a literal, factual description of human botany. It's a statement of agricultural origin.
I have to admit that recontextualization it takes this highly poetic existential dread and turns it into a literal biology textbook.
Or botany textbook, really.
Yeah, botany, you literally sprouted out of the dust. And if you know your biblical Hebrew, this makes weirdly perfect sense.
The linguistic connection is undeniable.
Because the Hebrew word for man is Adam, which is directly derived from Adama, meaning the ground, the red dirt, the earth.
Right.
We've always known the linguistic connection, but we treat it as a pun or a metaphor. The author is saying, no, the text means exactly what it says. You are a plant.
You are quite literally earth.
But it gets weirder. The wildest detail from the source isn't just this dirt birth. It's how the backward flow of time affects the human life cycle.
Yes, the aging process, or rather the de-aging process.
Right, because the author points out that in the age of Cronus, life is almost eternal. But people don't just live a long time and stay old. Because the cosmic clock is rewinding, they're born out of the ground as fully formed elderly adults, and then they get rejuvenated.
They age backward.
They age backward.
Think about the mechanical logic of that. If time is flowing in reverse relative to our current thermodynamic arrow, entropy is decreasing, not increasing. Decay is impossible.
Wow. So you literally can't rot.
Exactly. You emerge from the earth fully formed, carrying the accumulated years of your existence, and the passage of time physically restores you. You grow younger, stronger, more vital.
That's incredible.
And this is how the author solves the mystery of the antediluvian lifespans. Methuselah, living for 969 years, makes zero sense in our current biological framework of cellular degradation.
Right, your cells would just give out.
But in a universe where the flow of time is rewinding, where the fundamental physical imperative of the cosmos is rejuvenation rather than decay, an almost eternal lifespan isn't a localized miracle.
It's just the baseline physics of that specific cosmological age.
Precisely. It's just how the universe worked back then.
Let's sit with the environmental and psychological implications of this for a second, because I really want to dig into what it would feel like to exist in this state.
It would be profoundly strange.
The author paints such a vivid, almost unsettling picture of this reality. We're talking about a world where the celestial mechanics are completely inverted. A key detail from Plato's text is that the sun literally rises in the west and sets in the east.
Yes, the physical markers of the heavens are moving in the opposite direction.
And down on the ground, you have this idyllic, almost eternal society where more and more people just happily emerge from the soil as old men.
Right.
There are no children playing in the streets. There's no aging into frailty. It's just a constant harvest of rejuvenating adults, gradually shrinking back down into infancy until they eventually dissolve back into the earth as a seed. It's a bizarre, backward-ticking paradise.
It is a completely closed-loop system. Because there's no biological reproduction, the population isn't expanding exponentially.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. It is a set number of souls constantly cycling through this process of being yielded by the earth, rejuvenating and returning to it. It is a state of total artificial equilibrium.
But as we discussed with the wind-up toy analogy, this equilibrium is maintained purely by the tension of the divine helmsman forcing the spring.
Yes, it's an unnatural state, physically speaking.
And this raises the inevitable catastrophic question. What happens when that cosmic spring reaches its physical limit?
Because a manual clock cannot be wound infinitely.
Right. The physical universe is bounded. In this framework, the cosmos isn't a static diorama. The cosmic tension is constantly, silently building throughout the entire age of Cronus.
Yes.
The backward flow of time is pushing against the fundamental underlying architecture of reality, leading to an inevitable biting point, a critical mass where the nature of the universe must drastically and violently shift.
And that breaking point brings us to what the author identifies as the most dramatic and misunderstood pivot in the Genesis narrative.
The flood.
Well, the event that causes the flood, yes. The paper explains that eventually, for what they broadly term cosmic reasons, essentially the spring hitting its absolute physical capacity, the flow of time simply ceases its rewinding phase.
It just stops.
The helmsman lets go of the tiller. The universe hits a wall and is forced abruptly and violently into reverse. The tension releases.
So we shift from the age of Cronus, the age of the plant humans and the rewinding clock, into the unwinding era, the age of Zeus,
Yeah.
our current reality.
Yes, This is the moment the cosmic gears strip and catch in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
It is the release of all that pent-up kinetic energy.
I can't even imagine.
And the author notes that there are massive physical markers of this shift. It isn't just a philosophical transition. The entire physical universe experiences a kinetic shockwave.
Right, because momentum is a thing.
Exactly. The sun, which previously rose in the west during the prior eon, suddenly halts its momentum in the sky and begins rising in the east.
Oh my God.
The celestial bodies change their courses. Gravity, momentum, the very fabric of space-time is violently yanked in the opposite direction as the universe begins to unwind.
I can't even begin to imagine the sheer physical chaos of that event. If you're standing on a planet that suddenly instantaneously reverses its rotational direction, you aren't just going to look up and see a weird sunrise.
No, you'd be dead or close to it.
You are going to experience the immediate introduction of absolute kinetic destruction. The inertia alone would be apocalyptic.
It would tear the surface of the planet apart.
The text specifically states that this transition comes with abrupt and long-sustained cataclysms. The planet is essentially having a cosmic car crash.
A great way to visualize it.
I mean, the oceans would continue moving in their original direction, while the crust of the Earth suddenly moved the other way. The waters would spill out of their basins and rip across the continents.
Precisely. The physics of inertia demand it. And here is where the author connects the dots in a way that is incredibly profound and, frankly, provides one of the most elegant solutions to the Genesis narrative I've ever encountered.
Tell me.
They claim that this period of abrupt, sustained cataclysm, this violent kinetic gear shift of the cosmos, is precisely what is signified by the story of Noah's flood.
Wow.
In this Platonic framework, the Great Deluge is not just a really bad storm.
Right.
It isn't a localized river flooding, and crucially, it isn't primarily a moral punishment sent by a wrathful deity. It is the inescapable physical byproduct of the transition between two totally different cosmological physics engines.
Let me just pause and highlight how massive that interpretation is. Noah's flood is the sound of the universe stripping its gears.
Yes.
It's the physical friction of time reversing direction that completely reframes the entire narrative architecture of the flood.
It changes everything about how we read that event.
Yeah, it's not just rain falling from the sky to wash away sinners. It is the physical environment literally tearing itself apart because the fundamental laws of physics have just been inverted.
Exactly.
The water covering the earth isn't a tool of judgment. It's the chaotic displacement of oceans caused by a planetary rotational shift.
It changes the flood from a narrative of divine intervention into a narrative of cosmological necessity.
The necessity, right, because the tension has to go somewhere.
If the universe operates on this pendulum system, the transition point between the swings, the exact moment the forward momentum overpowers the backward tension, is going to be incredibly violent.
Yeah, you can't just smoothly shift gears when the entire universe is involved.
No. The Earth literally has to purge the old physical systems of the Age of Cronus to make way for the new thermodynamics of the Age of Zeus.
So the flood is like a system reboot.
That's it, exactly. The floodwaters are the physical manifestation of that sleet-wiping transition. They cover the Earth, churning the soil, resetting the atmospheric conditions, so that when the waters finally recede, the world can begin operating under entirely new physical rules.
And those new rules are absolutely brutal compared to the backward aging paradise of the prior age. I mean, once the floodwaters go down, the cosmic spring is unwinding. Time is shooting forward.
Yes, entropy is introduced.
The Age of Zeus has officially begun. And the most shocking and frankly tragic consequence of this new thermodynamic reality is that human biology, as we currently understand it, is about to be invented entirely from scratch.
This is the aftermath of the cataclysm, and it's where the text of Genesis gets notoriously difficult to parse, which, interestingly, the author uses as evidence for their theory.
How so?
The author draws a very sharp structural distinction here between the survivors of the old age and the new inhabitants of the unwinding age. The text notes that the forefathers who survived the transition, the figures who physically lived through the flood, like Noah, and his immediate descendants, maintain some of their old attributes.
Like their lifespans.
Right. They still lived for hundreds of years. They were carrying the residual temporal momentum of the Age of Cronus within their physical bodies.
Like a battery that hasn't fully drained yet.
Great analogy. But the newborn humans, the ones brought into existence after the cosmic shift locked into place, face a totally different and much harsher reality.
Because the earth doesn't grow people anymore.
No, the soil is dead in that regard.
The topsoil has been completely churned by the flood. The plant-human era is permanently over. The dirt is just dirt now.
Right.
So how do you populate a planet if the soil stops yielding adults?
And this is where the author introduces their most critical point regarding the human condition. Humans must now be created through biological means.
Sexual reproduction is suddenly introduced to the universe.
Yes, and because of this entirely new, unprecedented mechanism of creating life, these new humans live incredibly short, fragile lives compared to their Earth-born ancestors.
That's quite a downgrade.
It is. And the profound existential tragedy of it is, instead of being born from the dust as old men and living eternally, they're now born biologically as infants, decay rapidly through the forward flow of time, and return to burial in the very dust they used to sprout from.
The entire physical relationship with the Earth has been brutally inverted.
The irony is profound. The dust that was once the nurturing womb of humanity has now become its permanent tomb. You used to rise from the earth, now you are buried beneath it.
Man, that's dark.
It is. But the author takes this concept a step further, and this leads to what I think is the most challenging and brilliant reinterpretation in the entire paper.
Okay, I think I know where you're going with this. The genealogies.
Yes. It has to do with how the book of Genesis records the passage of generations. If you read Genesis, especially the chapters bridging the flood to the later patriarchs, you are confronted with these long, repetitive genealogies.
The economy of words, as the author calls it.
Exactly. Verse after verse, stating, so-and-so was born to so-and-so. Adam begat Seth, Seth begat Enosh, Enosh begat Kenan.
Yes, the infamous begats. It's universally the part of the Bible where people's eyes glaze over and they just, skip ahead to the narrative chapters.
It reads like a dry city registry.
Totally. But the author is claiming that we have fundamentally misunderstood the literal action these genealogies are actually describing.
Yes. When we, as modern readers, see the phrase so-and-so was born to so-and-so, we immediately instinctively project our reality onto the text.
Because what else would it mean? Right.
Right. We assume it means biological birth, a mother, a father, conception, 9 months of gestation, and delivery. But the author proposes a radical, shocking alternative based on the timeline of the cosmic shift. They argue that prior to the era of Abraham, the phrase translated as being born to so-and-so did not mean biological reproduction at all.
Okay, I have to stop and push back on this because this was an absolute brain-breaking aha moment for me when reading the source. But it also sounds completely insane on its face.
It does sound crazy at first.
Because the author claims that prior to Abraham being born to so-and-so actually meant that the parent unearthed the child from a pile of dirt, like they physically discovered them in the ground.
That's exactly the claim.
So you're telling me that when the text says Adam begat Seth, Seth wasn't Adam's biological son, but a fully grown adult that Adam literally dug out of a field.
Yes.
It stretches the imagination. How does the author justify translating standard reproductive language into agricultural harvesting?
It requires a massive paradigm shift, I agree. But let's look at the author's structural logic here.
Okay, lay it out for me.
If you accept the premise that Genesis is operating on the Platonic macromyth, then the transition from the age of Cronus to the age of Zeus wasn't a clean, instantaneous break on a biological level.
Oh, okay.
The flood shifted the macrophysics, but there was a lingering transitional period. The author suggests that this repetitive, almost mechanical language of the genealogies, this dry staccato list of names, is a reflection of this transition.
A transitional phase.
Right. It was a holdover from the age of Cronus.
Yeah.
The Earth was still possessing residual energy from the old timeline. It was still trying to yield humans from the dirt, but the mechanism was rapidly winding down.
So if I'm picturing, imagine these ancient quasi-eternal patriarchs, survivors of the old world, walking out into a post-flood field.
Right.
They see a patch of disturbed earth, and they essentially harvest a fully grown adult out of the ground, wipe the dirt off him, and say, this one is mine. I claim him. I shall name him Seth.
Exactly.
And that claiming process is what the text records as a begat. That is just wild.
It is a stunning visual, isn't it? And it perfectly aligns with the internal logic of the myth.
It really does.
It explains why the text treats these generations with such an economy of words. There are no stories of pregnancy, no maternal narratives in these early chapters.
Right. The women are almost entirely absent from the begat lists.
Exactly. It's just an inventory of unearthing. The patriarchs are claiming the last dying yields of the earth before the old physics completely fades away.
It's like the universe's battery is dying. The Earth is still trying to push out plant humans, but the forward flow of time is taking over. The cosmic clock is ticking steadily forward now.
Entropy is increasing.
Yes. And that means biological reproduction, an internal biological mechanism to counter the decay of the species, is physically inevitable.
The unearthing has to stop.
And biology has to start. But think about the logistics of that. If biological reproduction was a brand new cosmic invention,
A completely unprecedented mechanism.
yeah, something that had literally never existed in the history of the universe, the earliest humans forced to rely on it would have absolutely no idea what they were doing.
None. That is the inescapable logical conclusion of the premise.
It would be terrifying.
If a species shifts violently from agricultural reproduction, simply pulling fully formed adults from the soil to internal biological sexual reproduction, the physical, physiological, and psychological transition is going to be incredibly traumatic.
Yeah, evolution on fast forward.
The cellular machinery of the human body has to essentially reinvent itself on the fly. And this brings the author to their final synthesizing point.
The patriarchs.
Yes, it's the point where this cosmological theory flawlessly locks into the personal, intimate narratives of the later Genesis patriarchs.
Right, because when we move out of the bizarre mythical prehistory of Genesis and enter the narrative of the patriarchs, specifically the deeply detailed stories of Abraham and his son Isaac, the text suddenly slows down.
It becomes much more narrative-focused.
And there is a massive recurring dominant theme that drives the entire plot. Both of these men suffer from a crippling plague of infertility.
A very prominent theme.
Sarah, Abraham's wife, is barren for decades, leading to immense household strife and the introduction of Hagar. Rebecca, Isaac's wife, also struggles intensely with infertility, requiring divine intervention to finally conceive Esau and Jacob.
Rachel, Jacob's wife, faces the exact same agony later on.
Exactly. Every single generation struggles with this. And traditionally, every single commentary reads this as a theological motif.
Right, a divine test of faith.
God is making his chosen people wait for the promised child to prove that the covenant relies on divine power, not human capability.
That is the standard theological reading, yes.
Yeah.
But the author provides a completely unique mechanical conclusion based entirely on the Platonic framework.
Which is what?
They argue that this generational plague of infertility wasn't a localized medical anomaly. And it certainly wasn't a divine test of faith orchestrating human suffering for a theological point.
Okay, so what was it?
Instead, it is a historical recounting of the grueling physical adaptation that these specific forefathers had to go through.
Adaptation.
Yes. They were struggling to conceive because biological reproduction was a brand new, untested, and deeply alien physical process.
Oh, wow.
Their bodies were literally the beta testers for human biology.
Their bodies literally didn't know how to do it yet.
Exactly.
The cosmic physics had changed, the age of Zeus demanded biological birth to propagate the species, but their cellular biology was still trying to catch up to the new reality.
It wasn't a curse from God. It was a species experiencing the friction of speciation.
They were trying to figure out how their own reproductive organs worked for the very first time in cosmic history. That's just mind-blowing.
It is evolutionary adaptation happening in real time, recorded in the ancient text as a deeply personal, agonizing struggle.
The bodies of Sarah and Rebecca are caught in the crossfire of a cosmological shift.
Yes, they're trying to execute a biological function that the universe has only just invented. And this is where the author's theory really crystallizes into a unified, elegant thesis.
Everything connects.
As they state directly in the text, if you admit the myth in Plato, everything falls in place. Every single baffling anomaly of Genesis is resolved by this one key.
The strange, opposing ages of time.
The catastrophic global flood, not as judgment, but as kinetic displacement.
The bizarre dirt births and the unearthing of children.
The sudden, heartbreaking drop to short lifespans.
And the agonizing, multi-generational struggle to reproduce biologically, it all forms a perfect, structurally cohesive puzzle.
It really does.
So stepping back from the details, what does this all actually mean for how you and I should read Genesis? Because the author seems to be suggesting that our entire modern categorization of the book is fundamentally flawed.
Flawed in the sense that we're asking the text to be something it was never intended to be.
Right, like we've been trying to read a blueprint as if it were a photograph.
That is exactly the ultimate thesis of the paper. From this Platonic perspective, Genesis isn't meant to be read as a historical account in the modern empirical sense of the word.
It's not a history textbook.
It isn't bad history, it isn't primitive record-keeping, and it isn't just a collection of campfire tales. The author argues that Genesis is the logical unfolding of a cosmological myth.
The logical unfolding.
Yes, Genesis is essentially using the Platonic concept of time, the pendulum of the clockwork universe, the shift from reversed entropy to forward entropy as a blueprint of story-making.
A blueprint of story-making. I really love that phrasing.
It's very evocative.
It means the writers or the final redactors of Genesis weren't trying to faithfully record the literal day-to-day events of the ancient Near East.
Not at all.
They were taking a deeply complex, abstract cosmological theory, the idea of reversing time, shifting physical laws, and the catastrophic boundary between ages, and building a narrative universe around it to see how humanity would logically behave within those rules. If you think about it, it's almost like ancient high-concept science fiction.
That is a remarkably apt comparison. In speculative fiction, an author establishes the core physics of a world, no matter how bizarre, and then lets the narrative unfold logically from those premises.
Exactly. You establish the rules. Rule 1, time flows backward.
Right.
Rule 2, humans grow from dirt as old men. Rule 3, the cosmic spring breaks, time flips forward, and water floods the earth.
Rule 4, you have to invent sexual reproduction to survive.
Yes. Once you establish those rules, the stories of Methuselah, Noah, and Abraham aren't miracles or magic. They're just the logical plot points that must happen based on the physics of the world you built.
Precisely. And by viewing Genesis as the logical unfolding of this cosmological myth, the text stops being a frustrating, contradictory historical document that we have to make excuses for.
We don't have to pretend they were counting lunar cycle.
Exactly. It elevates the text. It becomes a masterful work of philosophical world building.
It really is.
It is an ancient attempt to explain the fundamental, agonizing realities of the human condition. Our inescapable mortality, our deep linguistic connection to the earth, the trauma of childbirth, our struggle to create and sustain life by mapping it onto the grandest possible scale.
The mechanical turning of the universe itself.
Beautifully put.
It is truly an incredible intellectual journey we just went on today. If you're still trying to wrap your head around all this, let's just briefly recap the sheer audacious scale of the author's vision here.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We started with a universe running backward, a giant rewinding clock governed by a divine helmsman where time physically restores rather than destroys.
The Age of Cronus.
Right. We visited the surreal age of Cronus, an era where plant humans are quite literally unearthed from the dirt as fully formed, almost eternal adults, making the phrase dust to dust a factual statement of agricultural origin rather than a funeral dirge.
Literal botany.
Literal botany. Then we witnessed the ultimate cosmic cataclysm, the universe hitting its physical limit, stripping its gears, and forcing the sun to violently switch directions.
The kinetic displacement.
Right, resulting in the chaotic kinetic displacement of oceans that we know as Noah's flood. And finally, in the devastated aftermath, we entered our own unwinding era, the Age of Zeus,
Which brought entropy.
which necessitated the desperate, traumatic invention of short-lived biological reproduction, a physical adaptation that early biblical figures like Abraham and Isaac had to biologically suffer through to ensure the survival of the human race.
It completely revolutionizes how one might approach the structural integrity of these ancient texts. The author shows us how a cosmological myth can be the architectural blueprint for a foundational story like Genesis, presenting it as a rigorous, logical unfolding of cosmic rules rather than pure, literal history.
It really does.
But looking at how seamlessly the ancients wove their cosmological understanding into their origin stories, it makes you wonder about our own narratives.
Oh, so.
Well, if ancient minds use the concept of a clockwork universe and shifting temporal mechanics to confidently explain the origins of life, death, and human biology, how will future civilizations look back at our current scientific stories?
Oh, wow. That's a thought.
Will our deepest, most foundational scientific theories of today, our infinitely expanding Big Bangs, our localized quantum mechanics, our linear evolutionary timelines be read by people thousands of years from now, not as absolute empirical truth, but as just another beautifully constructed, logically unfolding myth attempting to explain the fundamentally unexplainable?